In this live stream, we'll go over React state management using context and the useReducer hook. So why use context as a means of managing state? Well, you're probably already doing it if you're using a Flux-like library like Redux. With Redux, what you're doing is you're using the Redux store provider, and then you're setting it at maybe the root level component, and then so you can then subscribe to changes that updates your child components or any other components whenever you dispatch a change or an action. So with context, you can actually replace Redux and simply do everything natively using the React API. So let's get straight into it. I have a code sandbox created, and this is based off of the Create React App template. And so currently what you see right now is I have an app.js, and in this app.js, pretty much I have a function component app, and it uses local state. And so pretty much what it's doing is we have a counter here with a button, and so if you hit the plus button, it increments it, and we hit the minus button, it decrements it. And so we want to refactor this local state to use context and useReducer as a means of keeping the state as a store. And so first things first, let us create a provider component. So I'm going to create a new file, call this Provider.js. And then to create a context, we need to first import from React, import create context from React. And then let's create our context. So I'll create a constant and call it context. You can name this more explicitly. For this demo, I'm going to just call it context for simplicity, and then call create context. And so create context technically takes a single value, which is the default value, so that if you don't have any data passed to the provider value, it will default to that value. However, for here, I'm just setting to undefined. The reason is because when I do have my reducer set up, I will pass an initial state. So I don't have to worry about it not having any value. And then once you have the context, now you can actually destructure the provider from context. Just like that. And pretty much this is the same thing as doing const provider equals context.provider. And then from that, I can now export a default function component. This, I will name it store provider, and it will take in props as the first argument. And then this will return simply the provider component. And the children will be props.children. So this ensures that all your child components are rendered. Just like that. And then this provider component does require one required prop, which is the value. And this value is simply the data that is passed to any other component within the provider. So think of this like the global value that can be accessed by your child component or your child components. And this helps with what context provides in the first place, which is to prevent prop drilling. So here, I'll just put in a provider of 0 just right now as a placeholder. I'll update it later to use the reducer. But going back to my app, let's refactor this provider such that I can, instead of using state like over here, I can then simply consume from the provider. So first things first, actually, let me go to index.js. And then let's import provider component and make sure we render it at the root level. This way, the app being a child component of provider can get access to the context. So rendering provider right over here. Saving. Nice. And then going back to app. Here, instead of doing useState now, we want to use useContext. And so this takes a context. So we actually should, before we do anything, make sure to export this context so we can import it in App.js. And so let's actually import that over here as well. Import context from provider, just like that. And then here, we can get the value, and then we use useContext, and we pass in the context right over here, just like that. So let's delete the things inside increment as well as decrement. We'll come back to that later. And then remove state.count, and then this will be the value because we set it to 0, which was a placeholder from before. So if we save it, you should see that on the right, it's a 0. So of course the plus or minus buttons don't work. If we want to test that the value we provide is what we expect it to be, just set the value to 1 and see it changes to 1. So now we know that we have our context provided and it's connected to, the child is connected to the provider above. So here we can actually, next up, add our reducer. So a reducer is really nice. Let me just pull up the React documentation real quick. This hook, you're pretty much familiar with it if you're doing Redux already. The useReducer pretty much takes initial state, and then it's very nice in that, as an alternative to useState, you pretty much pass in the action, which comes with the type as well as the payload, and then pretty much it's optimized for updating state, complex state logic, and it's nice because it's also functional and pure. So here's an example that the React docs will show you. You can check out in the description below. I have a link to that. And we'll pretty much add our own reducer here as well. So let's go back to the import. We want to now import useReducer. And then let us create our initial state. So our initial state is, let's set the count to 0, similarly to how we did it in the store, or not in the store, in the local state of app previously. And let's create our reducer function. So the first argument is a state, second argument is action. Generally, you want to set the initial state here like this, initial state. However, the reason I'm not doing it here is because when we use the useReducer hook, the second argument is the initial state. So it seems a little redundant to do that, which is why I'm not doing it here. And then we have a switch statement, which we take the action.type. So this is a string. And then, let's add our cases. So I'll have a case for increment. I'll make it all uppercase just to follow the convention. And then when it's increment, let's say it gets updated by 1. So we have our state.count. And then let's actually increment it based on the payload value. So let's say our payload value is over here. Perfect. And then let's also add a case decrement, just like that. And then here we subtract. And then finally, just to make this yellow warnings go away, let's set a default. And here we want to throw a new error if none of our types match our cases. Cool. And so back to our store provider component, function component. Here, what we can do is we can call useReducer, pass in our reducer function, as well as our initial state. And then based on this useReducer function, it returns an array. And the array has 2 items. So the first item, array item, is the state, and the second item is the dispatch. So let's actually destructure that. So we have state dispatch equals, just like that. And then now in our provider value, we actually want to pass state dispatch. So now all the consumers of the provider can utilize the state and the dispatch. So we can save that here. And then if we go back to App.js, the value now should be the state as well as the dispatch. So let's do that, state dispatch. And let's just test it real quick that at least the state is correct. So if we change the value to state.count, just like that, and then we save it, you'll see that the 0 is back. Perfect, because that's the initial state. If you press the plus or the minus, nothing happens, and that's expected because we don't have the dispatch firing. So let's go to increment, and now that we have dispatch, we can do dispatch, and then set the type. The type here is increment, and then payload is 1. Then let's save it. This should refresh. The minus should not still work, but the plus now works. And now we can do the same thing for the decrement. Just like that. And I have an unexpected token. That is correct because I accidentally deleted the dispatch. So delete this. And then if I hit the minus now, there we go. You can now increment as well as decrement. And so pretty much at this point, you have your provider component with useReducer hook set up. Now, if you want to refactor, thinking of how Redux does it, you can create a constants file for increment and decrement. So let's actually do that real quick as a quick refactor. Constants.js. And then we do export const increment equals increment. Nice. And then we want to do that for the decrement as well. My ID kind of bugged out a bit, so I'll just do it like this. All right, cool. So now we have the constants exported and created. So we can now replace that here. It'll keep our code cleaner in a sense. Nice, I have that imported. And at this point, I can just use the constants. For the provider, sweet. And then for the app, same thing. Now these are now using the constants. Nice. And then another thing to note is that you can also refactor the useContext. If you're doing this a lot in different components, you can also refactor this to your own custom hook. Like, for example, you can create a useStore hook so that you don't have to constantly import the context as well as the useContext from React to do it. So let me actually do that as a quick refactor as well. And I'll create a hooks.js file. And then in the hooks.js file, let me copy this. And then let me also kind of copy this. Cool. Here, what we want to do is we want to export a function. Let's call it useStore. And then we have our useContext with our context. So we also want to grab our context over here, just like that. And then let us actually, can I just do this? Return context state dispatch useContext. Let me see, state is not defined. All right, so I'll just do it the normal way. Return. Oh, actually, what? It might be just simpler just to do this. Return useContext. Save it. And then, now if I do import useStore from hooks, gotta spell it right first. Nice, hooks, just like that. And then for here, I can do useStore just like that. And this should work. So let's save it. Waiting until the right side renders, and you'll see that it still works. Great. And then finally, one last thing to note is that, you can use the provider to access the data like that, or you can use the useContext hook. If you're using a class component, it will be the this.context, which you use inside of the class instance. And then there is also one more way to grab the context, which is you can also grab the consumer. So let me actually do like this. I'll do export const consumer. And then I'll show you real quickly how consumer works. Once I save this file, okay, going back to App.js. So now that I have consumer, so I'm going to comment this out as well, and then import consumer from the provider. Just like that. And then I will also comment these things out for now, just so it doesn't throw an error. And so the way the consumer works is you now have the consumer component like this. And the consumer, the props.children, is a callback function. And in the callback function, the first argument of that callback function is the provider value. So here, as you remember in our provider, the value is state and dispatch in an array. So state as the first array item, dispatch as the second. And then at this point, if I move my code inside of this, so this line should still work, the increment will no longer work. So let me just refactor it to an anonymous callback function, anonymous function, and then call dispatch inside of here. And so we have our type is increment, and then our payload is 1. And then let me do that here as well. And then if I save it, and this refreshes, let me do a refresh just to make sure. If I do plus and minus, you'll notice that it still works. And so this is the difference with the useContext versus using a consumer component with the callback function as the child. They both work kind of the same ways. You can use whichever that works best in your situation. I prefer the useContext hook. So that's just my personal preference. But that's pretty much it So you can pretty much refactor, most of your Redux components and stores to using context, and you're doing it natively, which is pretty awesome. And you know, it makes matching state super easy. So that's it for this live stream. I will definitely catch you in the next one. Thank you, and take care.